So first, I understand that there's an issue that has been raised in section this country.
Yeah.
Peter?
So you've spoken throughout the semester on the question of the knowledge economy, that there's a vanguard in the knowledge economy that's present in high technology.
And we're going to return to it today.
Great. So maybe this will be a good segue.
Yeah.
And you propose that we should open it up to more people in more ways. In section, among the undergrads, there's been skepticism raised about they can see how it can apply to high technology, but they wonder if this hope of opening up the knowledge economy to more people in more ways is limited to certain sectors of the economy. And so, for example, how do you bring the vanguard practices into, say, nursing or restaurants or lawn care or elder care, or, the range of sectors? So you can see it for how coders can have changing roles, can have lifelong learning, but what's your case study to apply to all these other areas?
So the answer to that question is unclear. And let me begin with the initial claim that the association, the exclusive association of the knowledge economy with high technology industry is a misunderstanding. So in principle, the knowledge economy can apply to everything. So take an extreme example, which is agriculture. So there's precision scientific agriculture. Now there's synthetic foods. So the frontier between what's natural and not natural is in fact open. Now you raise another issue which might seem recalcitrant to the expansion of the knowledge economy, which is personal services. A major area of expansion of economic life in the future as the formulaic activities become undertaken by machines. It seems that the refuge of the human is personal care of some kind. But even in personal care, there's a role for the dialectic between what's done by the machines and what's done by the people. So there is considerable experimentation already about the use of artificial intelligence in the performance of services that we consider personal. Now, a machine cannot adapt to personal circumstance and cannot give the precious and indispensable element of empathy. But the idea is not that the people would be replaced by machines. It's that there would be some combination of machine and people so that the machines could do what is capable of being repeated. So the answer is uncertain. How far can we go? What form will it take? No one knows. But what seems to be clear is that there's no a priori restraint on how far we can go. I think you could say a worrisome aspect of this advance is the idea that the indispensable element of the personal would be replaced by machines. But the positive aspect is that insofar as the machines do what can be made formulaic, the time of the people can be reserved for what is more intimately personal. So this is a great subject of experiment in the transformation of economic life. And I see no reason why we should have some a priori about what's possible and what's not possible. We don't know. The central point is that there's an open frontier. So let's not identify the idea of the knowledge economy with the substitution of people by machines. It rather has to do with a new way in which people and machines interact, so that the machines do the repeatable and the people are not yet repeatable. That's the basic answer that we give. Absolutely. Follow up.
So that answers the question of can machines apply to other sectors?
Yes.
And is there use of technology in other sectors? But another question is, there are other elements
those things apply to the example of personal care, right?
Well, I think there's an entrenched, I think possibly one of the most entrenched ideas in America, I think it's wrong, but others don't, is that, are you saying that the waiter at the restaurant, suddenly becomes the manager of the restaurant and then back to the waiter and where's the distinction? Like there are areas that are very hierarchical that people have a hard time imagining them not being hierarchical anymore by the nature of the work that is being done.
Yeah, I don't think that the idea of the transformation of the moral culture of production is a simple idea of the subversion of hierarchies. It's an idea of the expansion of the area of trust and discretion in high ways and in low ways. Actually, the activity of being a waiter is an activity that requires a great deal of discretion, or being a gardener, or whatever. This is another way to think about this point, is that these traditional craft activities, from the standpoint of the evolution of production, are what you could describe as pre-Fordism. They have the character of craft production. And a common thesis is that there is an affinity between pre-Fordism and post-Fordism. So pre-Fordism is customization without scale. The knowledge economy allows for the combination of scale with customization to an extent that is open, that is uncertain. It depends on the evolution. But it's true that the expansion of the knowledge economy into all these areas of economic life is uncertain. We don't know what forms it will take in these different domains. The central point is that there seems to be no basis for a dogmatic restraint that says here it can go, there it can't go. The frontier is open. And the character of all of these forms of economic activity can be changed by the transformation of the paradigm of production and the new relation between people and machines. The appetite for personal service is unlimited. This is one of the interesting characteristics of economic life, and one of the reasons why Marx and Keynes were, to my mind, mistaken in their claim that we're about to overcome the constraint of scarcity. The appetite of a human being to be taken care of by other human beings is unlimited. And that's then a huge frontier for economic activity and for the reaffirmation of the constraint of scarcity under these conditions. Would anyone like to discuss further this point that Peter has raised? So what I propose to do in this last class before the break is to attempt to complete the discussion of the themes that lie beyond the frontier of institutional and conservative social democracy. And in fact, there are two themes that remain to be discussed. One that is incomplete, which is the overcoming of the hierarchical segmentation of the economy, of the distance between the vanguards and the rearguards in economic life, and the other, which is the transformation of democracy, so that change not continue to depend on crisis. But what I hope to do is to include the discussion of democracy and the discussion of education through the discussion of the alternative economic order. And then in the weeks after the break, we can come back selectively to some of these themes about the content of the alternative. So let me again locate the discussion in our plan. So the argument I'm making is that a consequential economic alternative, an alternative in political economy today for the progressives, has to include at least three elements. The first element is a reshaping of the relation of finance to production, of finance to the real economy. The second element is a transformation of the relation of labor to capital. And the third element is the deepening and dissemination of the most advanced practice of production, and therefore the overcoming of the abyss between the advanced and backward sectors of the economy. In a circumstance in which the most advanced practice of production has become what I'm calling the knowledge economy. Now, before returning to the momentous theme of the knowledge economy, let me attempt to complete the discussion of the relation between labor and capital, to which I addressed in the second half of the class last week. So the focus last week was mainly on the short term, on the adjacent possible in the relation between labor and capital, with respect to the organized part of the labor market and to the disorganized part, that is, the part in which increasingly precarious employment prevails. I want to complete that discussion by focusing now not on the short term, on the adjacent possible, but on the long term. So, again, always in a programmatic argument. Two essential attributes are first, to mark the direction, and second, to select in the historical circumstance the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. So this is what the transformative politician or the political prophet and thinker has to do. He has to offer some down payment on the direction. The direction has to be manifest in something tangible, but the tangible cannot be the sum of the conception. You have to say, here's a foreshadowing of what I promise, and this foreshadowing has to be tangible. All of us are like St. Thomas, and we must touch the wound in order to believe. So this is the characteristic of transformative practice. And in a much earlier class, I remarked to you that there's a methodological implication in an intellectual exercise like the one that I'm attempting here, of course. The tendency is to emphasize the middle steps of a trajectory. So every transformation is a direction that can be part of at points close to what exists or points far from what exists. The advantage of emphasizing positions that are neither very close to what exists nor very far from what exists, the intermediate steps, is that it aids clarity, the explication of the direction. And that's what I've done here. But this has a great disadvantage in practical political life and discourse, because these intermediate steps are likely to seem too far from what exists to be credible, and too close to what exists to inspire enthusiasm. So the advantages of clarification in political practice and persuasion are overridden by this sense that whatever you're proposing is both utopian and impractical. Well, I don't worry about that here, because my main concern here is understanding clarification. So that's this deliberate preference for the middle level, the middle position of the trajectory. But in practical politics and persuasion, it's not like that. So in practical politics, what makes sense is to emphasize both what's very close to what exists in the initial steps and what's very far away, which is the vision. And thus, the discourse of transformation must be both practical and prophetic, while the explication has this scholastic characteristic of emphasizing the middle steps. You then have to correct in your mind for these circumstantial axioms and understand that it really doesn't matter, that to understand a procedure of transformation, you have to explore it at all levels, at all steps, from the very close to the very distant. And you have to operate simultaneously at all of these levels. So with that defense in mind, I then return to the discussion of labor and capital. And now focusing on the distant. So what is the large scale, the remote horizon that corresponds with respect to relation to labor and capital to the proposals that I discussed with you last week? Again, I suggest that there are three elements that are very closely connected to one another. So the first element, which we discussed in previous classes, is the relation of the worker to the machine. I mentioned this a couple of times earlier in the course. Under the previous dominant practices of production, mass production and its precursor, mechanized manufacturing, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines. Repeats the formulaic activities in Henry Ford's assembly line or Adam Smith's in factory. Now we have machines that are of a higher level, numerically controlled machines that can be reprogrammed as they're used. But nevertheless, under the aegis of the knowledge economy, we begin to have another idea of the relation between the worker and the machine. The worker, instead of being an echo of the machine, can become the antithesis of the machine. The worker does what the machine cannot do, and the combination of worker and machine becomes more powerful than either of them separate. So the basic idea is that the machine does whatever we learn how to repeat, so that we can do what is not yet repeatable. Now, this is a moving frontier. So something that we have not yet learned how to repeat, we later learned how to repeat and express in an algorithm or a formula, and then it can be done by machine. And we can complicate this picture in the way that I suggested before by imagining that there are three main stages in the evolution of technology. The first stage is the formulaic machine. That's the vast preponderance of the history of technology. The machine that is the physical embodiment of an algorithm or a formula. Now, it seems that then there's a second stage in the evolution of technology, and we're just in the beginnings of this second stage of what you could call the problem-solving machine. So it's goes beyond algorithms or formulas and solves practical problems by direct inference, or what the pragmatist philosopher first called abduction, from a mass of concrete things. So, for example, the use of artificial intelligence now has been applied to direct translation between natural language without formulating general rules of grammar. And that's the example of the solution of a practical problem. It's also an issue that arises, for example, in the design of autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, and so forth. And we're still in these very preliminary stages of this kind of machine that resolves what are irreducible, practical, pragmatic problems that can't be solved by algorithms and formulas. But there's something left, and this is the third stage. And it seems that the third stage is not capable of being operated by a machine, even in principle. And the third stage is what we call the imagination. So the imagination distances itself from the phenomenon and then subsumes the phenomenon under a range of transformative variations. The imagination is the aspect of the mind in which the mind is able to set aside its established methods and to defy its own established presuppositions and to see something which those methods and presuppositions don't allow. And then retrospectively to develop the methods and assumptions that make sense of what it has discovered. So the imagination is the part of the mind that is capable of envisaging and creating the new. And it seems that that's what a machine can, even in principle, do. So the human is what lies beyond the machine on this view, which is the third step. And that's a different view of the relation of person to machine. Yes?
So I think you're probably right when it comes to the large ideas, but in terms of small creativity, even there, the working together of machines and humans works pretty well. So if you see chess teams, usually the ones that combine humans and machines are the ones who are highest performing. Or in computer games with AI, there are new techniques that are developed by computers, namely AI machine learning, that is some kind of creativity that put together with the human mind usually is stronger than each one of them alone. So small-scale creativity, I think we are even there at the stage where both work together better.
Absolutely. So I agree with you completely. So I think the fundamental idea is we advance, and then we can encode, inscribe in the machines what we've advanced, how we've advanced. Not just what we learn how to teach, which is the first stage, and which is the vast majority of technology, but these problem-solving capabilities, for example, that are described in Piaget's cognitive psychology. So it's this pragmatic capacity. So what's left for the human? It's this residue of imagination and transformation, in which we're running ahead of the machines, right, of our machines. And the machines are becoming better and better, more and more powerful. And yet, in this radicalization of the idea of the knowledge economy, we think that we're not just an echo, a mimicking of our machines, as you suggested just now in this comment. So we're trying to be one step ahead of the machines in this frontier of the uncertain, of the imaginative. And it's that combination of the human and the mechanical which is more powerful. That's this conception. then come to think that the economy should be so organized that no person should do what can be done by a machine. So, it's a higher view. I mean, it's like, for example, the idea of a course, teaching a course in school. You have the principle, no course should be taught that can be replaced by a book. Well, under that principle, the vast majority of courses should not be taught. But that's the elementary principle, which raises our level of ambition. And so that's what we would look to in the future. That all of our time should be reserved for what these contraptions of ours can't do. So we'll be forced forward into this penumbra, into this frontier. So that's the first element of the long-term horizon. Now, it seems to me very unlikely that we would be able to exploit the potential of these technologies to that end, so long as economically dependent wage labor remains the predominant form of free labor. Because so long as economically dependent wage labor remains the predominant form of free labor, the control interests of those who buy labor in the name of property will always constrain or suppress this potential of the transformation of the relation of people to machines. So I go back to the discussion of the forms of free labor. The classical 19th century discussion of free labor is that there are three main types of free labor. There's wage labor, there is self-employment, and there is cooperation. So the classic 19th century view is that economically dependent wage labor is the inferior form that is tainted by characteristics of slavery and serfdom. And the superior forms of free labor are self-employment and cooperation. And this was the universal view in the 19th century up to the middle of the 19th century. So this is really something remarkable. We think that economically dependent wage labor is naturally and necessarily the predominant form of free labor. But actually this view was only naturalized, it only became ascendant in the latter part of the 19th century, and then achieved a complete ascendancy, hegemony in the 20th century. It wasn't the view up to then. So then we would think, with this long-term horizon, that economically dependent wage labor should gradually give way to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. So that the potential of the moral culture of the knowledge economy can be radicalized. The heightening of the level of discretion and trust, the creative aspect of work not just as a hateful burden, work not as just instrumental. It's hard to see how work could take on this higher characteristic so long as economically dependent wage labor remains the predominant form of free labor. Now, of course, among the many complications, one complication is that self-employment, involuntary self-employment, can be worse rather than better than wage labor. It can be simply the legal framework, the legal form of what I called in the earlier discussion about the short-term precarious employment, as in the case of the Uber driver. to imagine that this self-employment is genuine self-employment. Now, then we come to the following fundamental problem, which preoccupied the theoreticians and ideologists of the 19th century, but which they were unable to resolve. And the problem is that the legal and institutional background of the idea of self-employment is the supposition of a kind of petty bourgeois capitalism. So it's an economy of smallholders, of yeomen, of small-scale proprietors and entrepreneurs. The assumption is property-owning democracy in the form of traditional isolated property. Each one has his little patrimony, his little business. And that's why they're self-employed. And then they may cooperate. So Tocqueville visits the United States in the 1830s, and 4 in every 5 white men works for himself. Only 1 in every 5 works for another white man. It's a completely different social and economic reality. But this is inconceivable in the conditions of a contemporary economy. So then it seems that this idea of the ascendancy of self-employment and cooperation is an archaic dream, presupposing the perpetuation of what the Marxists call petty commodity production. So that then brings us to the third element in the long-term horizon. And the third element is innovation in the basic regime of property and contract of private law. So what happened under the social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century? In legal terms, what happened is that a new body of public law, the law of the regulatory and redistributive state, was superimposed on a largely untransformed body of private law. So social democracy retreated from the attempt to reshape the world of production of the private economy and focused on regulation and redistribution, and then on the cyclical, on the counter-cyclical management of economic life. But it abdicated the earlier idea of reshaping the organization of the private life. And that then produces this problem that you think, well, if there's going to be decentralization, and if there's going to be petty commodity production and self-employment and cooperation, we're going to be stuck in a world in which there are only small-scale producers and little family businesses. And that's incompatible with the nature of an advanced economy. So we then have to imagine that there will be experimentation in the basic devices of economic decentralization, in the way in which decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities will be organized. And the unified property right that was created in the 19th century that amalgamates all the constituent powers of property and vests them in the same right hold to the owner will then become just one form among many of economic decentralization. Will be good for some things and not good for other things. So I mentioned it has advantages. The basic advantage of the traditional unified property right is that it allows an individual entrepreneur to do on his own risk something that no one else believes in. And so he doesn't have to negotiate a series of vetoes or agreements with other interests. And we want to preserve that in part of economic life. But we don't want that, under this view, to be the only form, the only device of economic decentralization. And in other parts of the organization and production, we would want there to be fragmentary or temporary claims on productive resources, a disaggregation of the property rights, so that different right holders, local communities, workers, local governments, as well as investors, could enjoy superimposed claims on the same productive resource. So then we imagine that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form, that there's no unique way to organize the decentralization of resources, and that the increase of the absolute level of decentralization, that is to say, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account, may require the creation of claims on property, on productive resources as forms of property that are limited, fragmentary, conditional, temporary. So we actually increase the amount of decentralization by qualifying the absoluteness of property. And then we come to this idea that we would have alternative regimes of property and contract of private law coexisting experimentally within the same free market order, rather than reifying a particular version of economic decentralization. Now, so summarizing, the basic claim I'm making in this argument with respect to the long-term horizon is that these three elements that I described are actually all overlapping or connected. So the transformation of the relation of the workers and the machines, the supersession of economically dependent wage labor by the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, and the diversification of the legal mechanisms of economic decentralization in the form of the fragmentation or pluralism of the forms of property rights. Now, of course, this is as I say, this is not a discussion about the short term. No politician is going to propose this about something to be done in the next electoral cycle. But this is the evocation of a conception of a direction of the horizon, and with the intention of giving substance to the idea that the market economy is not there on a take it or leave it basis. That here we have a conception in which we're saying we can instead of just regulating the market, or instead of just compensating for the inequalities generated in the market by compensatory and retrospective redistribution through progressive taxation and social entitlements, we can begin to reinvent the market order in its constitution. And that's then a project of much higher ambition. And I do want to argue later, when I come back to this, that the radicalization and dissemination of the market economy in its remote stages requires some such experimentalism. Yes?
What about the constitution of society? How, if we imagine a different society like this, I agree, first of all, that everybody's time should be reserved for the things that have not been repeated. But Plato used to say that that a person is good at one particular thing, and everybody should do what they're good at. And I guess that society today is organized around this idea, more or less. So are we imagining a society without classes? Are we imagining a society that is closer to the Marxist idea or the anarchist idea of no divisions, at least when it comes to...
Well, but there are two separate themes there in your remarks. So one theme is the necessity or eternity of class society. And the other theme is the theme of the division of labor. So we're not universal. We become something in particular. Now, these two themes are entangled in actual history, but they're not the same. So it seems to me that one aim that must distinguish an ambitious, progressive, transformative project is that it insists on disentangling them. So it respects the need for the division of labor, the imperative of particularity. We become something in particular in order to be fertile in the world. But at the same time, we confront the necessity or the reality of the class division of society.
But they are connected, right?
They're connected in history, and the question is how we disconnect them.
But the politicians will have the power, and eventually they'll have the property power. Even though we may have different regimes of property law, I mean, this accumulation of power, which is historically connected with the accumulation of not only capital, but also the accumulation of knowledge or education.
No, absolutely. But if I could just step back to deal with a theme that has appeared recurrently in our conversations, but maybe has never been addressed directly. When today the institutionally conservative social democrats try to extend the range of their ambition, their characteristic tendency is to emphasize that there will be stakes, like, for example, minimum guaranteed income. Or another kind of stake would be a social inheritance. Everyone has a basic package of resources. So that's one way of expanding. Now, but the other way of expanding is to reshape the institutional arrangements of the market regime and of political democracy, so that more people can have more access to more resources and opportunities in more ways, and so that the sovereign people, rather than being asleep and being awakened only from time to time by crisis, are more awake all of the time and engaged in this transformation stuff. Now, this is a very important aspect of the discussion that's hard to make. It's hard to bring out to make explicit. The significant, the stakes are indispensable because we need to be secure and empowered in order to be able to act unafraid and capable in the midst of transformation. So there should be this dialectical relation between security and plasticity. So we become more secure, we become more empowered, more capable in this haven of vital protected interest and immunity, so that we can throw society open to a greater degree of plasticity. Now, this is not what's happened, because the tendency in this expansion of the traditional social democratic discourse has been to focus on the security but not on the plasticity. And the significance of states is very different depending on whether it's a complement to the reorganization of the economy and the politics, or it's a substitute for the reorganization of the economy and politics. And I, as always in these discussions, I'm taking the maximalist position. It's not a substitute, it's a complement. So we need the other part. You know, it's like the example I gave earlier in an earlier class about the fundamental substance theme in the discourse of human rights, comparing it to the relation of the parent to the child. The parent says to the child, I give you unconditional love. Now go out and raise a storm in the world. So what do we have in this discourse of states and of rights and of fundamental rights? It's just the part about the love. But what about the part about the storm? The storm has to be organized. And that's then a fundamental line of division in these debates. So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm urging.
So if we're going to summarize, but I guess that we would say that we need to increase social mobility first. Second,
that we need to?
increase social mobility first among classes, and second, invest in education in people so that they will be able to participate or create a higher power democracy.
So that's this theme.
In order to
That
create
in-
a egalitarian society
That
in
in
the future.
thinking about redistribution, we have to distinguish, the fundamental distinction is the distinction between changing the secondary distribution of advantage, which we do through progressive taxation and social entitlement, and changing the primary distribution of advantage. So the most powerful initiatives are the initiatives that reshape the institutional arrangements that determine the basic access to economic opportunity and educational capability. Everything else is secondary. Now, then I'm saying that with respect to those initiatives that change the initial distribution, we can distinguish two elements. The element of stakes or endowments, and then this element of opportunities and access through the reshaping of the institutions of the political and economic arrangement. And that's this point that I just made, that the buildup of the states means something very different, depending on whether it's a complement or a substitute for the transformation of the social and economic state. So my impression is that the Social Democrats are struggling now to expand their imaginative universe. And they're trying to penetrate this world of initiatives that influence the original distribution. So far, almost entirely with a focus on the stakes, as in the debate about minimum guaranteed income, and not on the rest. So it's a development, it's an advance. To my mind, it's an inadequate advance. But so that's how we might magnanimously see and hopefully see what's happening in this debate. Now then, unless you have some other proposition, what I'd like to do is to return to the discussion of the radicalization and dissemination of the knowledge economy, which is the third great theme of economic transformation, and deal with it in a way that incorporates the discussion of education and of democracy. So remember the dilemma of development as I described, which is not just a dilemma for the so-called developing countries, but a dilemma for all the societies in the world today. Conventional industrialization, by which we mean Fordist mass production, no longer works as a device for so-called unconditional convergence to the most advanced stage of economic growth, for all the reasons that I explored. But the alternative, which would be a inclusive form of the most advanced practice of production of the knowledge economy, seems to be inaccessible. So how can we deal with this dilemma? The argument is we can deal with the dilemma in only one way, by seeking to make the inaccessible accessible. That is, the dilemma can be broken only on the second side. There's no way in which we can bring mass production back to life as a device for the assurance of inclusive economic growth. The only way in which we can solve this problem is by finding some means by which to advance toward the goal of inclusive knowledge economy. Now, to do that, we somehow have to break up the requirements of the knowledge economy into pieces and stages. So the basic argument I'm going to make is that there are three sets of requirements for the dissemination and deepening of the knowledge economy. There are cognitive educational requirements, there are social moral requirements, and there are legal institutional requirements. And then we can ask ourselves, what are the background conditions in culture and in politics that make it more or less likely that we would be able to satisfy these requirements? So that's the shape of the discussion. So now let's then go by parts. So first, the cognitive educational requirements, as we discussed. Mass production barely required education. So traditional development economics paid lip service to the need for education. But under mass production, the worker barely needed to be educated. The worker needed a disposition to obey, rudimentary literacy and numeracy, and physical dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination. But nothing more than that. Now, under the knowledge economy, the worker really does need to be educated, and in principle then needs a very special kind of education. What kind of education? So it's an education that has to have the following four attributes. First, it has to accord priority to the higher order analytic and synthetic capabilities over the mastery of content of information. Second, because these capabilities cannot be acquired in a vacuum of content, the question is, what kind of content? What approach to content? And what matters with respect to content is not encyclopedic coverage, but depth, selective depth. So selective depth, organizing education around projects or themes, is more important than encyclopedic superficiality. The third attribute of this form of education is that it should, as much as possible, be cooperative in its social setting, cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools, between teachers and students and so forth, which is the method of advanced scientific work. Rather than what characterizes the vast majority of school systems in the world, which is the juxtaposition of authoritarianism and individualism. And the fourth characteristic, which is the most polemical, is that it be dialectical. There's no natural relation ever between a subject matter and a method. Every subject should be taught from opposing points of view. No subject should be taught just once. Every subject should be taught at least twice. Now, if we insisted on the idea of encyclopedic coverage, this would be not feasible, because have we covered this or have we covered that? But we're abdicating from that idea, and so we're privileging selective depth over encyclopedic superficiality, and so there's the dialectical idea. Basic education should be more profound than university education. The professors are engaged in a conspiracy to naturalize the marriage of method and subject matter. That's the organizing principle of the university orthodoxy. And the national curriculums in the world are infantilization of these university orthodoxies, projecting back to the education of the young. And attempt to emasculate the young and deliver them helpless for the higher stages of education, so they have to revive the orthodoxy of university culture. And what we want is to immunize them very early so that they arrive at the higher stages of education already prepared to repudiate the doctrine of liberal. So that's what, that's the conception of education. And of course, it's not just for economic reasons. It responds to what is the single most powerful theme in all of these arguments, which is the enhancement of agency. What is this all for? This is to make ourselves bigger and for a shared bigness and in all domains of our experience. Now, in the countries of the world, the advancement of this a pedagogic program like this one has as its threshold requirement the existence of a pedagogic vanguard. So a program like this cannot be implemented by a cabal of politicians, educational visionaries, and bureaucrats if there aren't thousands of teachers who are co-authors of this kind of project and engaged in it. Now, it's not as if this program, a program like this, didn't have forerunners in the world. It's not coming from Mars. So there are many anticipations of this kind of project in the world. They're all fragmented. Let's take the example of the United States. So the greatest educational theoretician in the United States is John Dewey, who was the ideologist of so-called progressive education in the United States. And Dewey's program, in a fragmentary and truncated form, shaped half of the American educational system. So the Americans organized a very dualistic system. There are two different educational systems in the United States. There's an elite of the top public schools in the richer areas of the country, and the private schools, and then there's the rest. So the rest is a kind of babysitting operation in which they're training people to obey and deal with information for a kind of work that no longer exists, mass production, which is declining. And then in the top, in this elite part of American education, what happened was the following. John Dewey's program had two parts. So one part was the emphasis on analytic capability. The other part was the emphasis on criticism and transformation. So the Americans rejected, or simply disregarded, the second part of Dewey's program, and they assimilated the first half. So one element in the elite half of American education is talking things through dialogically in groups to analyze problems. So that's the half they accepted in the elite part of their education. And they then rejected the other half about criticism and transformation. And what did they replace it with? The other half. They replaced it with a cultivation of a particular style of social interaction. So the individual is supposed to cast a glow of self-effacing charisma on himself in an atmosphere of cheerful and personal friendliness, in which he seduces but seems not to seduce, and is a part of the team. And so it's a very particular style of sociability, which is useful to accession to the American professional business class. So the object of education in those schools, at the top half of the American system, is dual. So it's the cultivation of this capacity for problem solving through dialogue and cooperation, combined fine with the cultivation of the style of sociability. Well, that's just an example, because if we look around the world, we find that this project that I described exists only in perverted or truncated forms. That's history. So, but it should inspire hope, because the project of transformation is not as if it were absent from the world. It exists in these partial and fragmented forms. And then we have to meet the historical reality of where it is. So that's the direction. Now, this direction applies equally to vocational or technical training and to general education. So under the traditional models of education, there was a radical discontinuity between general education and vocational training. General education is for the elites, and vocational or practical training is for the masses, for the workers. As in, the model of vocational training most admired and imitated in the world is the old German model of vocational training, focusing on job-specific and machine-specific skills. So there's 6 types of metal cutting lathes, and you teach the worker to use each of those and to be a plumber, an electrician, or whatever. Now we have to have a style of vocational training that emphasizes the higher order capabilities required for the operation of numerically controlled machine tools. And there's then a continuum rather than a contrast between vocational and general. It's the same spirit that then infuses both, and not a contrast of one to the other. Now then finally we have to ask, what is the practical basis in countries that are very big and very unequal, and especially countries that are federal in structure, like the United States and Brazil. Central imperative as the institutional setting for this project is to reconcile the local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. So the quality of the education that a young person receives should not depend on the happenstance of where he was born. To reconcile local management with national standards, we need 3 instruments. One instrument is a system of knowing what happens and what works, assessment. A second is a series of mechanisms of redistribution from richer places to poor places. The schools can't depend just on local finance. And the third instrument is a procedure for corrective intervention when the local system repeatedly fails to meet the minimum acceptable threshold. So that then becomes another part of this project. Yes?
So your approach to progressive alternatives to institutionally conservative social democracy seems to presuppose as given and permanent a natural, kind of an obligation to earn a living. So I'm wondering what happens when that is taken out of the picture, when we don't assume that earning a living is going to be the primary task of the citizen, and what it does to education, that we are still making our kind of like horizon point, the earning of a living, and in what way that is in conflict with making ourselves bigger.
Well, so this is related to a subject that I did bring up briefly in an earlier class, which was the view shared by Marx, Keynes, and others, that the double view that scarcity is temporary. We're on the eve of the overcoming of scarcity. And that work is a hateful burden, an instrumental imperative. Now, I said then, and I repeat now, I think both these ideas are mistaken. We're not on the verge of overcoming scarcity. In all of these societies, scarcity is endlessly reproduced in new forms. And work doesn't need to be just a hateful instrumental burden. It can be a device of the enhancement of agency, of the construction of the human being, which it's the idea of the transformative vocation. We change ourselves by changing the world. So that's a different conception, and part of the promise of the knowledge economy in its radicalized and disseminated form is that we begin to think that the economy need not be just a terrain of constraint, but may become a terrain of liberation.
So that makes sense. So we haven't really talked about cooperation versus self-employment because you're still monetizing labor. Work doesn't have to be a hateful burden, but does it have to be the tool by which we procure the means of our own material, like meeting our own material needs? And so there's this third form of free labor, which we haven't really touched upon as much as the other two.
Which is?
Cooperation.
Yes, cooperation but cooperation, the relation of self-employment to cooperation has to do with the regime of property. So the question is, how do we aggregate resources? So under the existing legal regimes, we aggregate resources in the context of the firm. And the firm is managed then by the representatives of the shareholders, the right of property. So we can imagine a set of arrangements under which teams of workers or entrepreneurs have access to productive resources and amalgamate achieving scale, not under the aegis of the traditional firm. So you can go very far in this. This is an exercise in the imagination of alternative property regimes. For example, imagine that the basic form of finance, of public finance, ceases to be taxation. And the state charges to all economic agents in society a basic underlying rate for access to productive resources. And those who are claimants to the use of those resources bid temporary use of those resources from the state, assuring the state of a basic payment, remuneration, for the use of those resources. That's the underlying rate of interest. And then they have conditional and temporary use of those resources. And they then organize, and they have a share in the gains, and they run the risks of losses. But we've then begun to reorganize decentralized economic order in a different way. So it seems to me that the question of what cooperation means in the interaction of free economic agents depends entirely on the details of these institutional regimes.
But so you believe we will always be trading our labor for our means of subsistence, though?
So what I think is that to the extent that scarcity persists, we would imagine that each of us must in principle have a role in the system of production. I think we should also have another role, all of us, in taking care of one another. So we should have a dual role. That was the argument about the practical basis of social solidarity or social cohesion. And the question is how we organize the performance of this productive role, under what regimes of property, and in what form of work, so that work ceases to be the hateful burden, the merely instrumental idea. So this was the conception of Marx and Keynes. The quicker we can get away from it, the better, so that we can then devote ourselves to private sublimities. We can be free from the division of labor as well as from scarcity. We can do one thing in the morning and we'll do the other thing in the afternoon, as Marx described in the introduction to the critique of the Gotha program. And then we have a higher level. This is the abandonment of a higher idea of work. If we look now at the knowledge economy in what I call its hyper-insular form, there are a tiny number of people who are not only gaining all of the profits, they're having all of the fun. And they don't want to leave their work. This shows that the consigning humanity to a kind of permanent retirement or dilettantism is not necessarily something we want. And it may not be something that's feasible if this imperative of scarcity persists. Yes?
But there might be a difference between not working at all and working 60 hours
Of course.
at Goldman Sachs.
Absolutely.
So maybe scaling back might be a point in your direction. So the idea to say that it's not either work or not work. It's usually if I spend work or time with my family and friends.
Sure, of course.
So the question is how you take this scarcity as given, because we usually want more services of other people. Not necessarily goods, but very often other people. Maybe an insight in reducing the scarcity might be the right way to go, to say that I probably don't need 7 people serving me food or 7 waiters, maybe 1 waiter and 2 machines do the same job. Or,
yes.
So that I get an insight in that I might need actually less, and for that
Correct.
aim of free time.
Correct.
How do I change this?
So if I understand you correctly, I agree with the basic thrust of your comment. So I interpret your comment as being a comment that the frontier between work and leisure doesn't have to be a watertight frontier. So it's not just that we diminish the amount of work and we have leisure, it's that there's a chain of analogies between work and leisure, and there's more of an open circumstance in which we can mix leisure and work, and there isn't a stark contrast between what we describe as leisure and what we describe as work. That seems to be a higher form, in which it's not just as if we give one coin to Caesar and the other coin to God, and we have these two radically different experiences. But so that our material life is part of our experience of self-construction. So I think it's a different idea, and what it turns on is the degree of hope that we can have in the qualitative transformation of our productive activities. So I suppose there are 2 approaches to it. One is to say productive activities will always have a burdensome aspect, but we can minimize them. We can minimize the time it takes, so we do something else. So that's one direction. And the other direction is to say we can diminish the extent to which what is productive and what is exploratory or private are different, are opposed. Huh? So it's true, and we can do both these things at the same time. Huh? And how much we'll get from one or the other, we don't know. Huh? But it seems to me that that both these directions are shaped by this ability to experiment with the form of the economic regime. So we're in both these directions, we're saying that the form of the free order is not is not given, and that we're tinkerable. Now, but we've sort of gotten away from the theme of the discussion of education, and I wondered whether you had some remark about the claims and proposals I made with respect to education itself, because this is a very particular program, a program for the transformation of education in a particular direction. And it seems to me that it is, I'm arguing that it supports the radicalization and dissemination of the knowledge economy. But in the radical form in which I described it, I don't think it could ever advance or be accepted, embraced, if it were not seen as being valuable for other reasons, as a conception of our transformation, of our, and under this idea of shared bigness. Now, the second set of requirements for the dissemination and radicalization of the knowledge economy are the social moral requirements. So remember, the knowledge economy, to deepen and spread, requires an elevation of the level of trust and discretion of all participants in the process of production, and a fluid mixture of cooperation and competition, rather than the rigid assignment of cooperation and competition to different domains of activity. So another way of saying this is that the knowledge economy requires a cumulative enhancement of the disposition to cooperate. Now, we tend to think that the accumulation of social capital or the disposition to cooperate is just a brute fact about society and culture, and not something that we can do anything about. But it seems that we can do something about it, and that there's not just a silver bullet, a single initiative, but a series of activities or arrangements that in their cumulative and combined effect would tend to strengthen the disposition to cooperate and the accumulation of social capital. So here are some examples just from our previous discussion, from different moments in our previous discussion. So one example is the cooperative character of education. So if education is organized cooperatively, other things being equal in the society, people will be more disposed to cooperate. Another example is the engagement of civil society in partnership with the state in the experimental provision of public services when we discuss the alternatives to administrative Fordism. A third example is the existence of voluntary and mandatory social service. So everyone has two positions in society, a position in the production system, so long as the imperative of scarcity survives, and a responsibility to help take care of other people outside the boundaries of his own family. In a part of the working year or in a part of his lifetime. So all of these are examples of initiatives that we can take in the practical organization of society that would seem to have an influence on the accumulation of social capital. And we don't have to treat social capital as just a brute given that is not capable of being modified by our conscious activity. So that's a simple argument that I'm making with respect to the social and moral requirements for the dissemination of the knowledge economy. And I think the central theoretical thesis is just this idea that I mentioned, that we can deliberately reshape social life to enhance the disposition to cooperate and the accumulation of social capital. No initiative by itself will go very far, but a combination of initiatives may have this cumulative and combined effect. Yes.
Do you see any of this living in education in any way? Are there ways to use the educational apparatus to reshape the disposition to cooperate?
Well, I just said I think so, if education is organized cooperatively.
Just that's the one element of it, is it? Or that
Well, that's the most overt element, right? Because, so how do you use education to strengthen cooperation? It seems to me that proselytizing cooperation is unlikely to be effective. It's much more powerful to exemplify cooperation. So it's not that you're teaching in the schools a doctrine of cooperation. We don't want the schools to serve as the device for this indoctrination. I think that what's powerful is the actual experience from a very early age on of cooperating. Now, going back to my American example, this was what happened in the fragmentary adoption of John Dewey's program in the elite part of their education. That's what the Americans did. In the best private schools or the top tier of the public schools in the United States, that's what happens. They get together around the table, they talk everything through. Analytically, they organize their teamwork to solve practical problems using analytical methods, and that's their preparation for accession to the professional and business elites. So it's a clear example of how cooperation works in education, the role of education. You actually teach people to cooperate, not by studying cooperation, but by exemplifying cooperation. Is that not true?
No, I think that's true. I'm wondering to what extent you meant when it's exemplified that there are existential and neurotic concerns that get in the way. Like, I wonder to what extent there's a psychotherapeutic piece that's missing. Because we can't just have cooperation exemplified. There are reasons we hold back from cooperation.
Yes, of course. Of course. So for example, there's the shadow of this ambivalence that we all have to one another. So so cooperation in education is under the shadow of this ambivalence. So there are different ways of dealing with it. Now, the standard way, let's say, the way of low ambition is the middle distance. So Schopenhauer describes in The World as Will and Representation the situation of humanity. So they're like porcupines in the cold. If they stand apart, they start to freeze. Then if they draw together to warm one another, they stick one another with their spines. So they go back and forth until they settle into some uncomfortable middle distance. And then one device for dealing with this is then to cast this halo of the cheerful and personal friendliness of pseudo-intimacy, which is the form preferred in this elite mode of American sociability. So it's a way of dealing with this problem. It's not the highest way. It's an inferior way. And we might seek other higher ways. Huh? But so this, and of course, all of these issues that have to do with our relations to one another are present in these basic experiences. Yes?
But this is a positive kind of conception of human nature. I think I have a different experience when it comes to education, but I have the feeling that it may be more egalitarian if we have this bipolar existent example, mainly in European countries right now, I guess elsewhere in the world, where we have the individual, all individuals in class, and the teacher, which is the authoritative kind of example, I guess. But in this cooperative alternative, maybe the power dynamics will be more evident since the very young age, and they will be actually formed and become more rigid in the future. For instance, the smarter person will dominate everybody else in the team, and that will be persistent throughout school education and actually empowered or facilitated by the educative system.
Yes. So, but one criterion by which to distinguish different levels of ambition with respect to this problem that you raised of the ambivalence is how a cooperative regime deals with disruption and the disruptors. So the higher it is, the more ambitious, the more it's capable of assimilating disruption. So this is a very simple and fundamental test. Antipathy to disruption and to disruptors is the sign of a lower level of cooperation.
It actually form human nature so that it will avoid going that road.
So if the idea of teamwork is the idea of just getting along and agreeing, then it's a lower level. The higher level is the level that is able to deal with the apostate, with the rebel. And we know how difficult that is. So it's a question of degree. It's the development of our moral imagination in the detailed experience of these regimes of cooperation. Now, the themes are all related. So there's a relation between the way we picture cooperation and what I described as the fourth attribute of education. It's dialectical. So if the content of education influences this, from the inception, this contrast of views, the role of heresy, of intellectual heresy, in the development of insight, then that helps create a situation that's more hospitable to disruption, because there's an intimate link between dialectic, cognitive dialectic, and social disruption. So that's just a higher level, and in the creation of a social and economic regime that is capable of perpetual innovation. So it's a fundamental point. If we go back now to a description of the economic characteristics of the knowledge economy, one of its central economic characteristics, as it spreads and deepens, is that innovation, instead of being just exogenous and discontinuous, becomes internal, endogenous, and perpetual. And so then disruption has to become part of the normal life of the economic regime. Perpetual disruption, perpetual innovation. Now, what kind of person can inhabit such a regime? A different kind of person. And the school system, the form of consciousness, has to bear a relation to that. I think this is a very profound theme. This isn't just about the economy. This is about who we are. So it's connected to a fundamental idea of our humanity, that we exceed the worlds that we inhabit. They are finite in relation to us. We are infinite in relation to them. We spill over. No world deserves us. We have no natural home in the world. And so we can only be ourselves or become ourselves to the extent that we are both insiders and outsiders. That's the fundamental idea of humanity. And these conceptions of education and this idea of the economic regime are expressions or extensions of that fundamental idea of who we are. Now, there's then a third set of requirements for the dissemination and radicalization of the knowledge economy, which are the legal institutional requirements. And in a way, we've already addressed them in these discussions about labor and scarcity. So imagine a series of stages going from the moderate to the radical. So how is it that we, at the moderate stage, at the initial step, how do we imagine the practices and resources and capabilities of the knowledge economy becoming available to a much broader range of firms and workers? So it escapes the insular vanguard, becomes inclusive. So the very first step, the task is to simply extend access to credit, to technology, to advance practice, to advance knowledge. First, to extend access. It's not subsidization of particular sectors against other sectors. The second element is then to coordinate the access. That's the most difficult part. Now, in a sense, that's what private venture capital does in its own little world. Because private venture capital, when it's effective, is not just a provision of capital. It's the organization of a network. But we have no developed example of how that's done outside the private venture capital space. And then the third element is identifying what works and disseminating the successful experiments. So we don't have a dogma about what works, we have to discover it as a result of this broadening of access. So let's say that's all the first stage with these three elements. Now I come to the second stage. The second stage is the emergence out of these experiments in the broadening of access of an alternative institutional architecture of the market economy. There are now two main models of business-government relations available in the world. There's the American model of arm's-length regulation of business by government. And there's the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And we would need then an alternative, a third model, in which we imagine a reshaping of the market economy on two axes. The vertical axis of the relation of the state to the firms, and the horizontal axis of the relation among the firms. So on the vertical axis, we say, we'll organize a form of partnership or strategic coordination between the government and the firms that is decentralized, experimental, pluralistic, and participatory. There won't be one trade and industrial policy. There will be many. And they won't be conducted from a central place by the unified bureaucratic apparatus of the state. There'll be many support centers intermediate between the state and the firm. Now, we actually have in historical experience a foreshadowing of this in the 19th century organization of agricultural extension, because that's how the system of family farming was actually organized in the 19th century, in the United States, for example. And then on the horizontal axis, of the relation among the firms, we develop a series of policies and legal arrangements that are hospitable to cooperative competition. So the counterpart to decentralized strategic coordination on the vertical axis is cooperative competition on the horizontal axis. Cooperative competition means the firms or groups of workers and entrepreneurs compete against one another, as the family farmers did in the early 19th century, but at the same time they pool certain resources, achieving economies of scale. And that's what I'm calling cooperative competition. And cooperative competition goes beyond the narrow form of cooperatives, as it's compatible with entirely distinct economic agents with their own accounts, with their own initiatives, but they're able to pool resources and to achieve economies of scale. And then the third stage would be that out of this intermediate institutional architecture, the second stage, we begin to develop alternative regimes of property and contract, the basic regimes of private law, different ways of organizing the decentralization of economic resources and opportunities. As in the argument I made before, we have traditional private property in some parts of the economic system, and then in other parts of the economic system, we have fragmentary, conditional, or temporary property rights to organize the superimposition of claims on the same productive resources. So then different regimes of private property and contract begin to coexist experimentally in the same market order. We begin to think the market order is not pinned to a single exclusive version of itself. So one way to understand this conception is by reference to the traditional conception of economic rationality. So the traditional conception is the economic agent has freedom to recombine the factors of production within an institutional and legal framework of production and exchange that remains immutable. Now, the radicalization of this idea is then that the economic agent has freedom as well to innovate in the institutional and legal arrangements of production and exchange, and not just in the combination of those factors within the untransformed order. So in a sense, it's a radicalization of the logic of the market, beyond defying the idea that the market regime has a single natural and necessary form. So that's what I'm describing as the legal and institutional requirements. It's a trajectory. And if you look at the third stage, you'd say that's utopian, that's very radical. But if you look at the first stage, it's very close to experiences and experiments that already exist. So what I want to argue is that the right way to think about these things is always as a trajectory, as a succession. You wanted to make a remark?
Yes, I wanted to make a remark about Mondragon. If you know Mondragon, it's a place in the Basque,
Yes.
which I think exemplify very much what you talked about.
Especially exemplifying the aspect of cooperative competition.
Yes, at the end, but it started in education. Like
Yes.
the priest who started it, he had 5 students. He taught them about cooperative values.
Yes.
And they started to cooperate.
Yeah.
They established a cooperative. The first one was like they sold stoves or something like that, and they established banks from it, and
Yeah.
I was thinking. But
Correct.
I was in charge of a think tank in Israel which sent an expedition to them. And after 50 or 60 years, I think, of work, they get into the system. They are having trouble with the third stage,
Yeah.
because you need to regenerate yourself.
Correct.
And some of the issues that from the society around them, it's like the gaps within the cooperative are not like in the Spanish society, It's narrower, but it exists.
Yeah.
And
Now,
then-
so this is a very interesting example to think about for the following reason, which has significance for the larger arguments. Given the limitations imposed by institutionally conservative social democracy, there is the tendency or the temptation to secede from the larger society into a smaller world, which is a kind of counter model of the larger society, right? So, so you organize a set of cooperatives, for example. You leave the larger economic regime and you develop this little world. Now, there's an ambiguity because there's the bad aspect and the good aspect. So the bad aspect is abdicating the struggle for power and thought in the society as a whole, right? There's no alternative at the end of the day to winning the power of the state. So the European radicals are often tempted to this idea that you give up on the state and you transform society piece by piece below. But the state makes the law, and the law are the institutions. And there's no alternative to making the law. Because if you don't make the law, then your enemies make the law. So that's the bad aspect, in which it becomes like an appendage to society, a flight from the struggle for the transformation of the regime. On the other hand, and this is the good aspect, to some extent, you can hope to develop in that world of secession a counter model of the national future. So there's a balance, there's a tension between these two aspects, between the illusion or the temptation on one side and the hope on the other. And we then have to examine each experiment in detail to see which of these tendencies is the predominant one. So the ideal is that the secessionist experiments should be just dialectical moments in a more ambitious and inclusive transformation. But this is a tall order. It's very hard to do that, because if you devote your life to one of these movements of secession, then you begin to mistake it for the real thing. And you begin to think that's an alternative to the transformation of society and of the legal regime. And it's not. Although it can make a great contribution to the larger practice. Now, I would complete the discussion. I don't really have time to complete it, but just signaling how I would complete it, or hope to complete it after the break, in the transition to a discussion of democracy, education, globalization, the themes we'll address after the break. You can ask yourself, under what conditions in culture and in politics does it become more likely that we can satisfy these three sets of requirements that I've just described? The educational requirements, the social moral requirements, and the legal institutional requirements. So those conditions, those background conditions, seem to have to do primarily with culture and with politics. In politics, the organization of a high-energy democracy that does not need crisis to make change possible. And in culture, the radicalization of an experimentalist impulse in every department of social life. Now, once again, let's focus on culture, because it's very close to what we've discussed here today. Once again, we can ask with respect to experimentalism, as we did with respect to cooperation, to what extent is it just a brute given, and to what extent is it something that we can do something about? Now, it seems that, again, we can do something about it. We can take initiatives that, in their combined and cumulative effect, radicalize the experimentalist impulse in culture and in social life. And again, I'll give you some examples. So first, the anchor in education. If education takes on this dialectical character that I described, we can expect that dialectical character to strengthen the experimentalist impulse. Everything is taught twice. Everything is taught from contrasting points of view. The young are immunized against the orthodoxies of the university culture. A second example is that we organize society to make it easier for people to change direction in their careers. So they become one thing. We're universal, but we have to mutilate ourselves to become something. And then we have to somehow remember the missing limbs, which is the basis of our imaginative empathy. But we can organize society, especially as we become richer, to make more possible the change of direction. Now, a third example. The state can act as a mega venture capitalist to invest in the experiments of the young. Let's take the example of a small and rich country like Norway. It has a huge sovereign wealth fund. Now then we have the idea, no one should be condemned to live a small life just by virtue of having been born in a small country. So the state then says, we will invest in activities of young Norwegians to go around the world to set up a set of businesses and or philanthropic activities or social activities. And they'll do this for part of their lives, and then most of them will come back home, transformed by these experiences, and they'll shake us up. And so we won't be just like a rich village, a bunch of rich peasants. They'll come back and they'll set this on fire. And so that's an example of using practical opportunities to change the role of the experimentalist impulse. Now, the fourth example, and the most fundamental, is we increase the security of people in a haven of endowments, of capabilities, of safeguards. That's the element of the stakes. But as the counterpart to the organization of the store. So this is something fundamental. What do we need to do? We need to make people unafraid. So they're unafraid, unshaken, unsubdued, unterrified. But not so that they'll rest, so that they'll not rest. So then we have this double task of making them unafraid and capable so that they can withstand the storms, but then organizing so political and economic life so that it helps produce the store. So that's the other side. So this is a different conception. And it's intimately related to this idea of our bigness, of our shared bigness, the central idea of the political imagination, the idea of greatness. That it's not the humanization of society, it's the divinization of humanity. We become more human by becoming more godlike. And that's what the radicalization of the experimentalist impulse is about. So have a very good break, and we'll come back and we'll pursue this to the relentless end.
Really,
Yeah.
I have a really quick question. I'll send you an email when we get back to sort of maybe sit down and talk
right.
through a little more.
This
But there's a paper for the class. I know it's early.
It's nice. Even if you don't have to study.
Okay.
It's nice.
I was
to
better
sleep
on something.
Yeah. Sleep and stuff. Right, yeah.
To engage
That's like
So the idea
yes, during this year at least.
the idea is that you deal with the subject and allow you to sort of So the idea is that you deal with
No, we don't. We have, if we want to
engage in the show how the other teams
like all the
leads to a series of
they
positive
have to like
processes.
Right. Actually, I mean, we can talk more about this. I was brainstorming for another independent piece I'm doing on, this is about the American race, but I want to sort of talk about forms of government that would sort of promote this experimentation. Maybe use the paper to sort of explore a little sort of strong presidential system, and sort of maybe look at some case studies. But we can discuss this.
Great.
Thank you.
Tudo bem?
Bom, professor. Nós vamos uma dúvida que eu fiquei, como o senhor diz, né, da evolução do trabalho livre em direção ao self-employment, às cooperativas, o senhor imagina isso acontecendo, quais seriam esses passos intermediários e isso aconteceria em que processo, né, da sociedade caminhar em direção a essa economia do conhecimento?
Não, mas é como eu digo, na fase anterior, o autoemprego era comum. Nos Estados Unidos, por exemplo, antes de meados do século passado. E a economia do conhecimento é, em princípio, muito favorável à disseminação do autoemprego. Subcontractors, em vez da reunião de um agrupamento quase militar de comando e controle sob uma liderança